Look familiar? We all know these landscapes. We certainly know this. So the question becomes is how do we go from something, an arterial that looks like this, which is in every community USA. Has anyone ever been in a community larger than, say, 25,000 people and you haven't seen this? Can anybody right now in your mind imagine a place in your own community that you just think, God, this place is a wreck. How can we fix it? Right? So keep that place in mind as we go through this. So the question really becomes, how do we go from that to this, where the people and not cars are celebrated on the street? And so when I think about suburban retrofit, I think about how we can change the scale of a place that is predominantly auto-dominated to a place that is predominantly pedestrian-oriented. And I really don't want to get hung up in semantics because many suburban places, many of those places that have that auto-dependent feel can actually be found within our city boundaries. And I show up this example of Rochester, New York that took an old, what's that called? An old, help me out, car dealership, thank you. Car dealership into and replaced it with 77 new residential houses. Auto-dependent to something that's more pedestrian scale, that's within the city boundaries. So when we think about transforming these landscapes, what we're really thinking about is changing the scale to a more human scale. And then the big piece is, in my mind, of where we are in this going into the 21st century, is that we're helping places evolve. We didn't always used to look like this. Look at this, consider Boston in 1640. 1775, 1877, 1920, 51, 2005, and more common, with the Greenway now, more common day. Places evolve all the time, and I propose that the time is now to turn our attention to our suburban landscapes. And why now? Well, in part, our population is growing. We're expected to add another 100 million to the U.S. population sometime in the next 35 to 40 years. And not only is our population growing, the demographics are changing. Our population is aging, and we have the 20 and the 30-somethings. These two demographics are consistently trying to get rid of their car and to move into places where they can live, work, shop, and play in the same neighborhoods. But it's just not those two demographics. Across the board, over the last 15 years, there have been essentially 36 polls given out to communities, given out to people. And consistently, 30 to 50% of the poll responders say that they are looking for a more urban environment in which to live. They're looking for a place where they can live, work, shop, and play all in the same place. Think about that. That's 30 to 50% of the population is looking for something like that. And then you combine that, all of these forces with, you know what, we actually have a lot of development opportunities. The University of Utah estimates that there's almost 3 million acres, almost 3 million of acres of gray fields, which are essentially parking lots and abandoned buildings that are just primed for redevelopment. In my mind, this is a perfect storm. These demographics, these trends are a perfect storm of why I think suburban retrofit will be the hallmark of the 21st century. Okay, well, so how do we start? Like if I was a mayor, if I was a planning commissioner, I'd be like, all right, you've convinced me. Where do I go from here? So this is where it gets complicated, and this is why not a lot of folks have done it. But across the board, what folks want to do is you want to look at your regional planning. You want to make sure that you get the streets right. You want to add more green. Across the board, this is going to happen in every single place. And every single retrofit project. What is going to differ is whether or not you're going to take a more incremental approach, kind of almost do it project by project, or whether there's going to be a master plan redevelopment where it might be phased. And in the end, you get to a pedestrian scale environment. It's unclear to us at this juncture whether or not an incremental type of redevelopment is really going to yield the kind of pedestrian scaled redevelopment project that we're seeking at the end. But we'll talk about some examples of both as we go through it. So let's begin to break down these different steps and to kind of dive into it. So the regional context, where to start? Every single community, including Detroit, every single community have assets to leverage. There's areas of opportunity. I was recently in Topeka, last summer I was in Topeka, Kansas, and what the city was the first thing that they told us, they said, we're smack dab in the middle of the country. We're equidistant from both coasts. And that really demonstrated to me how creatively you can think about assets. Many times what folks narrow in on are, we have a tech corridor, we have a rail station, we have a waterfront, but you can think really creatively. So when you begin to thinking about how to identify our sites, where are your public assets that you can begin to leverage? Let's break this down a little bit more. I think that the first question right now in 2013 a local government can ask itself is, do we have transit or not? The U.S. government in 2013 will be spending $64 billion in transit just this year. There's an incredible investment that is happening at the state, local, and federal level on transit. So if you're talking about leveraging assets, I think that's the first place to start. But many places don't have transit. So you might want to start thinking about, do you have any underutilized sites, such as a parking lot, abandoned shopping center? And then I think you want to break down those sites more. If you do have transit, do you have any underutilized sites within a half a mile? Are any of these sites near or adjacent to public infrastructure? Are there any infrastructure upgrades planned around these? These begin to get a community thinking about, where do I have sites available and where am I going to be placing investments, right? Then thinking about, where do I have existing or emerging employment areas? Maybe that's not it. Has the community identified any needs or planning? Do they say, this is what I want? Having community support for a redevelopment project can be incredibly important to a project. And then finally, are there any properties on the market or any properties that could be bought or sold or that might be soft? Not every project is going to go through here. This is not a perfect flow chart, nor is it intended to be. It's intended to kind of tee up some questions for mayors and for local planning commissions to begin to narrow, oh my gosh, I have 10,000 acres of auto-dependent landscapes that can be retrofitted. How do I begin to choose? It's massive. So this is just a framework. Let's play it out. In Sandy City, Utah, it's a first-ring suburb. I was out there skiing last March, a year ago March, and I was driving around and I just saw tons and tons of surface parking lot, right? But what I also saw were 2 metro stops and a metro line. And I saw 2 schools, a high school and an elementary school. And in this particular area, you have a historic city, you have an historic district, you have a stadium, you have a movie theater and a university. Well, those are a number of assets. So you might want to look at redevelopment opportunities right there. So again, the framework isn't intended to be an absolute flow logic, the flow model. The framework is really intended to start teasing up questions to help you begin to narrow your focus. And that's exactly what Sacramento, the Regional Council of Governments in Sacramento, California did. They conducted this blueprint process, and over a course of about 4 years, they held public meetings with over 5,000 citizens to really determine for the community where and how does the Sacramento region want to grow. And within that process, they began to identify prime areas for redevelopment, right? Where do we want to grow and where do we want to preserve? But what's interesting, so I knew about this, and then in 2004, Blueprint Sacramento won a national award for smart growth achievement from my office at the EPA. So I've known about this project forever, and I've always thought it was, a great kind of example of public involvement. But what I didn't know was what I learned from a developer last summer while I was still at the EPA before I came up to be a Loeb. Sat down with the developer and I was like, so tell me, how's this blueprint process working out? He says, it's great. It has absolutely clarified our thinking and clarified the predictability, and we now know where to go out and to look for sites, and we now know where to go and develop. And so this whole idea of looking at the regional context is really beginning to help Sacramento redevelop some of their underutilized sites. So let's go to those principles and apply it more to Sandy City, Utah. This past January, I was able to co-teach a January term course at Harvard called Retrofitting Suburbia, Policies, Politics, and Designs with my co-teacher Deanna Van Buren. And we use Sandy City, Utah as an example. The place where I showed you is right up in here, but coincidentally enough, Sandy City, the planners there, had identified this whole area called the Sandy City Civic Center redevelopment as an area that was primed for redevelopment. Right? You have a mall here. Here's our 2 metro stops that I pointed out. There's a historic district. Let's dive into it a little bit more. It's got considerable public transit that is being underutilized. It's an investment that the public sector has made. In the area that we looked in, you have a warehouse that's underutilized. You have mini storage units. You have pad sites, which are vacant, abandoned industrial sites. You have a nursing home. Here's the historic district up here. You have some kind of low income, single family homes. These are relatively high income. These homes sell for about $80,000. These homes over here sell for about $320,000. You have a university, DeVry University, as well as a theater district. You have a lot of potential. There's really just abandoned. This is more self-storage and empty sites. Here's the expo station. Going down, this is the expo center site, 1,600 parking stalls. So you have this station that's essentially has parking on two sides of it and a high school or an elementary school on the other side of it. So how are you going to best be able to maximize that area?